Russia has been violently trying to conquer Ukraine for more than 2 years. U.S. friction with Iran is rising amid a wave of Mideast violence surrounding the Israel-Hamas war. And the United States is facing a generational challenge in confronting the autocratic rise of China, whose military, intelligence, and diplomatic power are threatening U.S. leadership over the free world like nothing since the Soviet era. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and this is the Threat Status Special Video Series. For this edition, we're very fortunate to be joined by House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul, a Texas Republican who's had a direct hand in shaping U.S. national security from within the halls of Congress for more than a decade, and currently has the critical responsibility of leading congressional oversight of President Biden's foreign policy. Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. It's been a while since we sat down together. I believe it was at the height of the Islamic State in 2016.
Right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. The world has changed quite a bit since then. Let's jump right into it. Why is the Ukraine war still going on? Why has the U.S. spent more than $75 billion in cash and equipment? And what's your assessment of where we go from here, especially with Russia showing no sign of ending the war?
Well, I think the short answer as to why is it still going on is this administration has not given them the weapons that they need to win. And I've been putting a lot of pressure on the Jake Sullivan, Secretary Austin, give them the longer range ATACMS that can hit the bridge between Russia and Crimea. Give them the air cover that they need. We wouldn't put our troops in that situation. So I think what you've seen is because they've slow walked the way they put the weapons in, they've also played into Putin's hand. What Putin wants is a long, protracted conflict, a war of attrition that he knows eventually he's going to beat down the will of the American people, and then most likely, the Europeans. And I think to some extent he's won that. I think what I tell my colleagues though is that it is in our national security interest. If we fail in Ukraine like we did in Afghanistan, if we surrender like we did in Afghanistan to Putin in Ukraine and allow him to take over and threaten, Moldova and Georgia, possibly the Baltic nations, then we are talking about our men and women in a fight, in a war. And that's the last thing we want. But the question is, are we going to be stronger or weaker by pulling out? I would say we'd be weaker.
President Biden, rhetorically, he says, we'll stay in it and continue aiding Ukraine for as long as it takes. But there's a policy divide about that within the GOP.
Yeah.
And especially on Capitol Hill, but we're seeing it play out in the presidential campaign as well.
Yeah.
Where are you at on that divide? And is that a concern? And why is it that there are some in the Republican Party that are, calling for halting the aid, perhaps unless President Biden agrees to significantly beef up funding for stopping illegal immigration on the southern border, for instance? Walk me through that.
Well, the president says as long as it takes. My question is, why does it take this long? It shouldn't have taken this long. He's mismanaged the war, so it's very difficult to sell it to colleagues, to an administration that has not properly handled it. I think that's part of the problem.
It's difficult to sell it to Republicans.
Yeah, and I get that. And they just want to know, what is the objective? Is there accountability? We came out with a report. Mike Rogers, Armed Services, Mike Turner, House Intelligence, and myself about a plan for victory in Ukraine. And that's our members want to know, what are we going to do for victory? The other thing is we passed the Repo Act, which will take the frozen Russian sovereign assets to help pay for this war rather than the American taxpayer, and let Russia pay for its crimes. To me, that makes a lot of sense, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just passed that out of committee as well.
There are some Republicans who've been accused by the administration and others of kind of spouting Kremlin talking points about the war, or being duped into projecting Russian propaganda. Is that actually happening? Is that something that's a concern of yours?
Well, there is Russian disinformation, and I think some of the rhetoric you hear mimics what the Russians are throwing in terms of disinformation. You know, I'm kind of a Reagan Republican, the first president I got to vote for. And I often think, what would Reagan do? Reagan talked about how we're a leader of the free world. We need to maintain our leadership standing in the world. If we shrink from that and abandon and surrender, I think it puts us in a weaker position that will only invite more aggression. If we fail in Ukraine, guess who's looking directly at that? Chairman Xi, China, who's looking at Taiwan and the Pacific. You know, the Ayatollah, they're all linked together along with Kim Jong-un, and now we see the Middle East on fire.
We've called it the axis of tyrannies, but let's shift gears here on that. CIA Director William Burns says that China poses the bigger long-term threat. How well prepared is the U.S. right now to counter China's rise as a global military power?
I think we're still superior militarily, but they're catching up very quickly. And so this is a great power competition, both economically, but also militarily. The thing that China's been very good at is technology, things like hypersonics. They shot one around the world with precision. We don't have a hypersonic weapon. Yet most of that was built on the backbone of American technology, spy balloon, American component parts. We got to stop selling them the very technology that they put into their PLA and their military apparatus. And at the same time, we got to stop capital flow investments. They go directly into their war machine. I think that would be dangerous. Now, the Pacific's a different animal. I mean, you know, I was at Indo-PACOM with Admiral Aquilino. You know, we don't have NATO in the Pacific. We have partners and allies. So we we flew to Japan, South Korea. The Philippines have a forward operating base. But we need to, there are not enough maritime assets, particularly around Taiwan, to provide deterrence from an invasion by Chairman Xi. I'll give you a good example. I sign off on all foreign military weapon sales. 22 systems have yet to go into Taiwan that I signed almost 4 years ago. So when I was there last spring with President Tsai, she said, "Where are my weapons? You know, I paid for them." And we have a defense industrial base issue.
So it's being slow walked a little bit. Let's drill into what you were saying about China and U.S. technology. One of the tools that could be in our box to counter China's access to high-end U.S. tech, whether it's AI or things that could be used in missile systems, is the Bureau of Industry and Security within the Commerce Department, the BIS.
Right.
Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has said that the BIS needs more personnel. It doesn't have enough funding. And this is really the body within commerce that can oversee and potentially halt exports of the most sensitive technologies. You recently put out a report in the committee essentially saying that BIS isn't able to do its job, or currently in its current form isn't doing its job, and is actually facilitating China's rise as a global military superpower. What's the problem here with this? How do we fix that?
They're outmanned, they're outgunned. I think BIS, and I have jurisdiction over them. I'm Foreign Affairs Committee. I think the issue is the dual-use technologies, the aerospace technologies that China wants to get a hold of, and they have. What they don't steal, and they steal a lot of intellectual property, we unfortunately sell to them by way of export technology. So we got to toughen up the export controls. How do you do that? You look at the sectors that the technologies are going into, and you provide an export control ban. So that would be, artificial intelligence, right? Quantum computing, hypersonics, and supercomputing. These areas we know are going directly into their war machine. And if we prohibit the sale of those technologies, we could stop assisting them, because eventually they're going to turn their sights on us.
Would it expand BIS's powers and efficiency if that part of the Commerce Department were perhaps made into an intelligence agency?
Yeah, and I think the issue, I can go back to 1997 when I prosecuted the Johnny Chung case, trying to help the Clinton campaign. It was China Aerospace and putting money in his bank account. I mean, the issue is, how do you deal with a country that is buying all this? BIS has always been at commerce more industry driven rather than security. And so I've met with Dr. Estevez, the director, Director Estevez, about, hey, you gotta start shifting more away from industry commerce to more of a security environment, because what you're doing is you're actually helping China build the largest threat to the United States. I agree with the assessment of our intelligence community that they will be the biggest threat. And when you look at AI, and they've been able to develop 7 nanometer chips now with old legacy machines that we have sold to them, and the Netherlands through ASML, 7 nanometers takes them directly into AI. And what I think you're gonna see in the next decade is, these automated AI, planes, ships, tanks. They call them killer robots. And I think this is gonna be the future of warfare. So whoever really masters AI first, and it's in machine learning, as well, along with quantum computing, will master who wins this great power competition.
Let's shift gears again here, because your portfolio is so broad. What is your assessment of President Biden's Iran policy? Is it failed completely? How likely is it that we're heading into a direct major war with Iran? And how do you assess the policy?
Well, I would say generally I would assess it as appeasement. I would assess, particularly with respect to Iran. They want an Iran deal more than anything, so they would make concessions. For instance, not sanctioning oil exports, $80 billion going into Iran that funds their terror operations. But I would say overall, projecting weakness, not strength. We saw Neville Chamberlain, Hitler. You saw, Churchill talk about strength and not appeasement. Reagan, peace through strength. This president has projected so much weakness, and it all really started, in my judgment, with Afghanistan. With the fall of Afghanistan and the surrender to the Taliban, our adversaries viewed that as a very weak moment. And that's when you saw the aggressive behavior of our adversaries like Russia. We saw the Russian Federation going towards Ukraine right after Afghanistan. We saw in the Beijing Olympics, Chairman Xi and Putin with their unholy alliance, also tied to Kim Jong-un and the Ayatollah. That's when everything started to change. And you can see our adversaries are becoming more aggressive, and they're lighting up.
What is one thing that the administration could do right now to staunch or fix the Iran policy?
Well, I think the maximum pressure campaign was squeezing them. I think a couple of things. I think we need to provide deterrence. There have been 160 attacks on our troops in Iraq, Syria, and in the Red Sea.
By Iran-backed proxies.
Iran-backed proxies like
Houthis,
Houthi rebels, Hamas obviously going into Israel, Hezbollah, and the Iran-backed militias. 160 attacks with almost zero response, very weak response. I think what needs to be done now is a very strong, decisive showing of force that we are not going to tolerate the killing of U.S. servicemen and women, and hitting the IRGC present in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen would be a good start. But I think we also have to telegraph to them
kinetically, striking.
Precisely.
Not hitting with the type of sanctions the administration has come out with.
Well, I think the sanctions, to enforce the sanctions on energy exports, on the oil exports, which is $80 billion, they need to do that, but they also need to hit the IRGC that are outside of Iran, their operatives. And it would be quite easy. We know where they are. And then lastly, I think we need to send a message, probably in a more clandestine way to the Ayatollah that, look, if you keep killing Americans, we're going to strike within Iran. Now, I think all options should be on the table. I'm not one of these individuals that thinks bombing in Iran should be the first step here. We don't want to escalate this anymore. We don't want a war with Iran, but the fact is they only understand force in that part of the world, and they need to understand there will be consequences to bad behavior.
So we're in an election year here. How badly is U.S. foreign policy consistency in danger right now, given the argument held by some that presidential elections are the weakest point in democracies? And how important is it for the U.S. to project some kind of consistency, considering that we may well see a change in administration at the end of the year? How important is it for us to convey to foreign partners and adversaries that there is going to be some kind of consistency? Is that
well? I would
challenging in
say
an election
I would argue that hopefully with a Republican in office, you're going to have more strength and deterrence. The lack of consistency would be we will not be projecting weakness anymore. We won't be inviting our adversaries to strike us.
Yeah.
And that is what I worry about the most. You know, my dad was a bombardier in World War II, bombed the Nazis. I haven't seen a threat like this to Europe and the Pacific really since my dad's generation. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope we can deter China. But on the current path, we're not providing much deterrence at all. And we certainly haven't done it well with Russia and in the Middle East right now.
So in closing, what is it that you see from your very unique perch here as really the biggest threat facing the United States right now?
Well, I think kinetically, Iran getting a bomb, and they're very close. Remember, our special envoy to Iran he's under FBI investigation for security clearance violations. Russia, the threat, but I think China. I think long-term China is going to be the greatest threat to the national security of the United States. And they're very clever and very smart how they operate. They're very good at stealing. They're not one to say we're going to strike, but if they do strike Taiwan, are we in a position to defend Taiwan? Or will the American people even care about it? Now, I would argue Taiwan, 90% of their advanced semiconductor manufacturing of the global manufacturing takes place in Taiwan, TSMC. And think about that. If China owned or broke 90% of the global manufacturing of semiconductors, puts us in a really bad spot. And that's why, Mike Pompeo came to me when I chaired the China Task Force, and I introduced authored the Chips for America Act to pull supply chain out of China, manufacture it either here in the United States or with our allies. But we have to do a better job from a diplomacy standpoint, economic standpoint, and military.
Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul, thank you so much for joining us for the special Threat Status video series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.
Thanks, Guy.